And now, welcome to 7 Questions with Emmy.
Brought to you by Timberline Home, whose showroom in Idaho Falls is waiting for you to explore. Hey guys, welcome back to 7 Questions with Emmy. Today I'm really excited to be talking with Kristen Tracy. She grew up here near eastern Idaho, and she's the author of a bunch of cool books, but she just came out with this one, When Beavers Flew. It's a true story that happened here in Idaho, and it's about, well, when beavers flew. So thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Emmy. I'm excited to be here.
Would you like to get started with the questions?
Yeah, I'm a little nervous, but let's get started.
Don't be nervous. No need to be nervous.
Okay.
Question number 1. Where did you come up with the idea to write When Beavers Flew?
Well, since it's a true story, I came up with the idea when I encountered the true story. And that happened when 2 things happened. There was a woman who works in Boise for the National Public Radio, Samantha, right? And she did a story on it. And I think at that time, Sharon Clark, who works with Fish and Game, uncovered the video footage of it. And then once you see Fur for the Future, the historic video footage of parachuting beavers, the story just really comes to life. And when you see these crates of these loaded beavers in these crates, parachute dropped from airplanes to relocate them, your mind just goes to places of what were those beavers thinking? How did this work? And it felt like a story kids would really connect to. And I thought, I have a child who's really interested in beavers, and he was really interested in the story when he came across it. And I thought I could do something with this. This is fun.
That's cool. Do you know if the beaver program is still alive and well in McCall?
So what happened is, because they took the beavers out of McCall to put them in this roadless wilderness area, which is now the Frank Church Wilderness Area, there are still beavers in McCall. And what they do there that you might find interesting is at the airport every year, I think in June, they take a stuffed animal beaver and they eject it from an airplane with a parachute on it. And they parachute drop a stuffed animal beaver out of an airplane. But there are real beavers in the McCall area. But then that conservation effort that they did with those 76 beavers that they dropped into the wilderness area is doing incredibly well. And it brought back a lot of animals that hadn't been there in a long time into those wetlands. And so that is one of the most successful conservation projects that people talk about in terms of translocation. Because when I first started the book, I thought, oh, great, I'm going to learn how you move animals around. This is great. But the more I looked at it and I talked to Fish and Game, it's a terrible idea to move animals around.
Yeah.
And most of the time it makes people feel good to think, oh, there's this animal, it's a nuisance, I'm going to move it. But it usually ends up just killing the animal, because you take it to an animal with a place it doesn't know, it doesn't have a social structure or social network. But what Elmo was able to do is he was able to take 76 beavers, and so it kept their social relationships intact. And he was able to move them into an area where they actually belonged, and they didn't have predators, and they were able to build out in a really safe space.
You grew up just down the road here. What did you like about living in Idaho?
So growing up in Idaho, one thing I have to say is that my sister teaches at the school in Yukon. She's a 2nd grade teacher where I went to school. And my dad has a propane company just further up the road in Rexburg. So I'm still very connected to Idaho, Emmy. I go back all the time. When you have a childhood, what's happening is you're having experiences, particularly as a writer, that are things you're later going to go on to write about, but also it's creating your whole lens for the world, right? And so I grew up in a news loop where it was in the Yellowstone Park news loop. So I grew up fascinated by bears. And most of the time in all of my books, you're going to encounter bears, because every summer people were attacked or had bear encounters. And I grew up thinking that was very normal, because that was my news stories. That was, people, buffalo or bison or the geysers. And so that was like a really interesting, unique thing that I didn't understand was different at all. I just thought everybody had that childhood, right? And it wasn't until I was older that I realized, oh, not everybody grows up like that. And the other thing that was really important that happened to me is when I was in elementary school, when I was crossing the street to get on my school bus, and I lived like out in a very rural part of Yukon even, I slipped on a patch of black ice and I fell underneath my school bus. And I was underneath the school bus and I thought, this is very bad. And I heard the sound of the school bus door like shut. And I'm like, this is really bad. But then the door opened and I crawled out really fast and I threw myself in a snowbank. And my bus driver was like, are you good enough to board? And I thought to myself, wow, that's a good question. And I'm like, no. And I went home, but I didn't tell anybody about it. And then years later, my sister went to a Christmas party. And she's like, you'll never guess who was at the Christmas party. It was Linda Gilbert, our bus driver. And I'm like, oh, she said you fell underneath the school bus. Did you fall underneath the school bus? And I said, yeah, I did. And she's like, Linda went on to become the head of bus safety, for the school district. And she petitioned for an extra mirror on school buses. She counted heads that day. That's how she knew. And I was like, oh. And I thought about it. And at the time I was writing a book and I didn't know how to start the book, but it was my first book. And it was Camille McPhee Fell Under the Bus. So growing up in Idaho and having that experience and falling underneath my school bus, it turned out to be a really important thing. And you can see like here, there's like a girl dancing on a bucket. Well, when I was in 6th grade in Mrs. Mackey's class, I was cast as a dancing cat. She wanted us to be able to be seen over the other animals. And so she had us dance on buckets. And so I danced on my bucket and I twirled my tail. And so all these things that happened to me when I was in Yukon, like they find their way into my book somehow.
Why did you decide to be an author?
So I think that those decisions happen tiny, tiny, tiny over time. And so first of all, growing up, I thought I was going to be a marine biologist, but I was living in Idaho and I never learned how to swim and I was super afraid of animals. And so probably not the best career choice, though I did go to college in California, in Los Angeles. But when I was in school, I just realized like I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And so I told myself, I'm just going to take classes that seem interesting for a semester and see what happens. And when I looked at my schedule, I realized I was taking things that I was going to be an English major. And so I was like, well, I guess I'll be an English major then. And then my teachers were like, you are really good at writing. And my poetry teacher was like, you're so good at poetry. You should take my graduate seminar. And I was like, really? Like I had never written poetry before. And so I was in the poetry seminar and I loved it, Emmy. I was like, oh, I love this. And so it didn't even occur to me a person could be a poet. I didn't even know that was a thing, but I'm like, I'm just going to write poetry for a while and see what happens. And I started writing poetry and I just kept doing that. And I went to graduate school and I did a master's in it. And then I did an MFA in it and I taught it for a while and I did a PhD and I was like, wow, I guess I'm going to be a poet. But then I looked around and a lot of the people that were poets, like professional poets that I knew were not happy. And that scared me because I'm like, well, do I want to be not happy? And it's like, no, I want to be happy. And I also wanted to write children's books. And so I thought I probably should do both of these things. And as I was doing both of those things, I got an agent. I started selling the children's books. And I thought, I really like the children's book stuff. So I'll do both. I'll do poetry and children's books. And that's kind of how that happened.
Do you ever want to write a book for adults? And what would it be about?
So that's an interesting question. When I first started writing in graduate school, I really hadn't chosen, I'm going to write for kids or, I'm going to, So the first story I had to write, it just happened to have a child character in it. And I wrote about her and she was Camille and my whole class really liked her. And my teacher was like, you should write more stories about Camille. So I wrote some more stories about Camille. And then I sent these stories to adult literary magazines and they really liked her. And they're like, oh yeah. But I realized like, it's gonna, I'm not going to make any money, like selling these things, you could basically, when you publish your work in adult literary journals, they just give you copies of the journal. And like, you can't go to the grocery store and be like, here's some copies of literary journals. You need money. So I was like, well, I'm going to have to write books. So I started writing Camille McPhee Fell Under the Bus. But really, that could have been an adult book had I just changed a few things. So I don't know. And then I have a book coming out I'm going to show you the art for the first time. This is an exclusive. So I have a book called The Unofficial Alcatraz Handbook coming out, and it comes out this September 24th. And I used to be a volunteer gardener on Alcatraz. And when I was a volunteer gardener on Alcatraz, I helped restore their historic gardens, and people would ask me questions all the time that I did not know the answer to, a lot about Al Capone. So I researched many things about Alcatraz, and I've actually ended up becoming friends with Al Capone's granddaughter to help answer some of these questions. I really think this book could have been an adult book, but it just happens to be for a younger audience. So I think a lot of times writing for adults is more like a marketing decision than necessarily about topic, if that makes sense. And then the other thing is, because I was a poet, I finally did write a book. And this is a book that's considered for adults. It's my first poetry book I wrote, and it won the Emily Dickinson First Book Award. And so that happened. And so, but it's not fiction. And so I think you meant that in a fiction sense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you ever decide to come out with one, I'm sure my parents will read it.
Okay.
You know that Idaho is known for its potatoes. What is your favorite way to have a potato?
So if I'm anywhere and I see like something that looks like a casserole with crunchy little cornflakes on it, I think to myself, funeral potatoes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those look delicious. So I really like those. But I am not picky. I really love tater tots. My mom used to take a baked potato and mix tuna fish, like scrape it out, do this twice baked thing, a little bit of horseradish sauce. I love those. My grandma used to make a great potato salad with a little bit of Catalina Island dressing, was her special touch recipe. So I like you, I'm a fan of all potatoes. I think they're great. And when I was probably your age, they took us on field trips, and two that really stuck with me was one where they took us to look at soil erosion, and they would just take us to like these places with giant cracks in the ground, and it was terrifying. And I just remember thinking, like, how much longer can any of us live with this much soil erosion happening in the world? And the other thing is they took us to places where we looked at soil that was like healthy. And they talked about all the volcanic deposits in the soil that make the potatoes grow better in Idaho than anywhere else. So that's always stuck with me, that it's the volcanic ingredients that have been mixed into the soil.
That's cool. What advice do you have for people that want to publish a book?
So the thing that I didn't quite realize when I started writing is how much time you spend by yourself. Right? Because you have to. And the thing that I have found really nourishing about being a writer is picking really good friends, because they are a good support system for you. But also, maybe it was a few years ago, I studied with the writer Meg LaFoe, who wrote the Pixar movie Inside Out. And she is really smart. And one of the things she said, it's really important to know thyself. And I thought about that a lot, because it sounds simple, but it's really actually a complicated thing. Because if you really know yourself, you know your interests, you know your obsessions, you know when it's time to pivot. Because when I first started writing, I wrote a lot of young adult novels, right? But then after I had my own child and I read a lot of picture books with him, I pivoted into that space. Some people might feel anxiety about doing that and think like, oh no, but I've made this market of writing young adult novels. I shouldn't move into this new space. But I didn't feel that way. If I wasn't listening to knowing myself, like I would probably have anxiety and be scared to pivot and make choices and do things like that. Because I see other people, not even just writers, but they're afraid to make changes, right? And I don't have that, like, but I think it's because I really, like, I know who I am, and that it'll be totally okay for me to suddenly start writing about U-boats and, moving to Germany. Like, I'm going to be okay. But I think that not everyone feels that way.
Thank you so much for talking with me today.
You're so welcome. I mean, you're very sweet. Do you want to be a writer? Is that something you think about, that you might want to write books?
Yeah, maybe. That'll be fun.
Yeah. What kind of books do you think you'd want to write?
I don't
What
know.
kind of books do you read?
A lot of books. Graphic novels, mainly fiction books. I'm not really a nonfiction type reader. But like I read this though, like
Yeah. No, I know. I didn't take that as any disrespect.
yeah.
No, because I saw your interview that you did with Kate DiCamillo. So I get a sense that that's like one of the lanes you like to be in. So that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks so much for watching. Remember, new 7 questions interviews are posted every Thursday. Be sure to follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Love you guys. Bye. 7 Questions with Emmy, brought to you by Timberline Home, whose showroom in Idaho Falls is waiting for you to explore.